So you want to build a castle. You have seen the paintings. The great stone fortresses rising from hilltops, with pennants snapping in the wind, towers catching the last of the evening light, a drawbridge lowering over a moat that shimmers like something out of a storybook. It is magnificent. It is romantic. It is the single most effective way to announce to everyone within a 50-mile radius that you are powerful, wealthy, and not to be trifled with. It is also, and this is the part the paintings never mention, the fastest way to bankrupt yourself that the medieval world ever invented. A modest castle could cost the equivalent of decades of a skilled worker's wages. A serious one could consume the entire annual revenue of a prosperous lordship and still not be finished. The stones are beautiful. The debt behind them is staggering. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these, and drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself comfortable and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in. Let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. Why did most early castles have almost no stone in them at all? What did a medieval lord actually pay for a single window? How could a master mason earn more than most knights and still not be considered a gentleman? Why was the chapel sometimes the most expensive room in the entire fortress? What happened to the lords who ran out of money halfway through construction? Did the moat ever actually stop anyone? Who got rich from castle building, and why was it almost never the person who ordered it built? Congratulations. You have just woken up on a muddy hillside in 1260-something. There are oxen, there are arguments, there is a man shouting about limestone, and you owe more money than you have ever seen in your life. Welcome to the most expensive decision you will ever make. Before we start hauling stone, though, we need to answer a question that sounds obvious, but really is not. Why would anyone do this to themselves? Why would a medieval lord voluntarily pour the wealth of an entire generation into a building project that might take 20 years to finish, and might not be finished even then? The easy answer is protection. Walls keep enemies out. A castle is a military installation, a defensive fortress, a stronghold against attack. And that answer is not entirely wrong, but it is nowhere near the whole truth, and in many cases, it is not even the main reason. The real engine behind most castle building was not fear, it was politics. You are a lord in England sometime after 1066. William, the man who just conquered this island, has a very specific strategy for keeping it conquered, and that strategy is stone. Or more accurately, it is the threat of stone. William and his successors built or ordered the construction of roughly 36 castles across England in the 20 years following the conquest. These were not charming fortified manor houses. These were statements. Enormous earthwork mounds topped with timber towers, planted in conquered towns, on river crossings, on hilltops overlooking restless populations. And they said one thing very clearly. We are here, we are staying, and we brought the construction industry with us. It was the medieval equivalent of a corporation buying the tallest building in a city it just acquired. The building is not strictly necessary for daily operations. The message it sends absolutely is. Now here is the part that catches most people off guard. Those early castles, the ones William threw up across England in the years after the conquest, were not stone at all. They were earth and wood. A motte and bailey castle was a mound of packed dirt with a timber tower on top, surrounded by an enclosed yard, protected by a wooden palisade. You could build one in a matter of weeks, with enough forced labor, and William had plenty of that. Stone came later, sometimes decades later, when the initial military occupation had settled into permanent political control, and the lord, or the crown, decided that the statement needed to be louder, more permanent, and considerably more expensive. The shift from timber to stone was not a military upgrade. It was an economic escalation. You were not just defending territory anymore. You were investing in it. You were telling the landscape and everyone who lived in it that you planned to be here for centuries, and you were backing that claim with the most expensive building material available. And this is where the economics start biting. Because building a castle was not just an expense, it was a political obligation. If the king granted you land, he expected you to hold it. Holding it meant building on it. Building on it meant fortifying, and fortifying meant spending money you might not have on a structure you might not survive long enough to enjoy. You did not get to quietly pocket the rents from your new estates and live modestly. Modesty, in the post-conquest landscape, looked a lot like weakness, and weakness invited someone hungrier to come and take what you had been given. Your castle was your resume, your credit score, and your insurance policy, all rolled into one monumentally expensive package. There was also the matter of permission. You could not simply decide to build a castle because you fancied one. The crown controlled who was allowed to fortify, and the mechanism for that control was called a license to crenellate. Crenellations are the notched battlements along the top of a wall, the classic castle silhouette, and building them without royal permission was an act of defiance that could end very badly for you. The license was both a privilege and a leash. The king wanted lords to build because fortified lords held territory effectively. But the king also wanted to control who built and how much, because a lord with too large a castle and too thick a wall was a lord who might start having ambitions that extended beyond his own estates. A lord with a modest fortification was a loyal subject. A lord with a fortress that rivaled the king's own castles was a problem. Think of it like this. A modern government wants businesses to invest in infrastructure, but it also wants to regulate what kind of infrastructure gets built and where. Build a factory the government approves of, and you get tax incentives and planning permission. Build something the government considers threatening to its interests, and you get investigations, delays, and a very uncomfortable conversation with people who have the authority to shut you down. The license to crenellate worked on exactly the same logic, except the consequences for building without permission were considerably more violent than a planning tribunal. You wanted the king's approval not just because you needed it legally, but because having it signaled that the crown trusted you enough to let you arm yourself in stone. Not having it signaled that the crown considered you either irrelevant or dangerous, and neither of those was a comfortable position. So the first secret of castle building is that it was almost never purely voluntary, and almost never purely military. It was a political performance funded by private wealth and regulated by royal suspicion. You built because you had to hold land, because you had to project strength, because the king expected it, because your neighbors were doing it, and because the alternative to building was to look like someone who could not afford to, which was an invitation to every ambitious cousin and land-hungry neighbor within riding distance. Not building was the most dangerous financial decision of all. It just did not look like one until it was too late. And then, of course, came the question nobody asks in the paintings. Where exactly are you going to put this thing? Choosing a site sounds like a military question, and the history books will tell you it mostly was. High ground for visibility, a river bend for natural defense on three sides, a rocky outcrop that is difficult to assault. All of that is true, and none of it tells you the most important part of the decision. Because the single factor that determined whether your castle would cost a fortune or cost 2 fortunes was not the view from the battlements. It was how far you had to move the stone. Transport was the silent killer of medieval building budgets. Quarrying stone was expensive enough on its own. Cutting it from the rock face, rough shaping it at the quarry, and preparing it for transport all cost real money in labor and tools. But moving it from the quarry to the building site could cost more than all of those things combined, depending on the distance and the route. Overland transport by ox cart was agonizingly slow, brutally hard on the roads, murder on the wheels and axles, and punishingly expensive per mile. Moving a cartload of stone 10 miles by road could double its effective cost by the time it arrived at the site. 20 miles could triple it. The oxen themselves needed feeding, the carts needed constant repair, the roads turned to swamps in wet weather, and every delay meant wages paid to drivers and handlers who were producing nothing while they waited for the mud to dry. If you were unlucky enough to choose a hilltop site with no nearby quarry and no river access, you were essentially paying twice for every single block that went into your walls, once to cut it and once to drag it uphill through conditions that would make a modern logistics manager weep into a spreadsheet. Water changed everything. A castle site with river access, or, even better, coastal access, cut transport costs so dramatically that it could alter the entire financial equation of the project. A single river barge could carry in one trip what would take dozens of ox carts the better part of a week to move overland. Edward I understood this perfectly when he selected the sites for his enormous castle-building program in North Wales in the late 1280s and 1290s. Nearly every major Edwardian castle was positioned to be supplied by sea. Conwy sits on a river estuary where ships could dock practically at the foot of the construction site. Caernarvon sits on the Menai Strait with direct access to seaborne supply routes. Harlech sits on a clifftop, but a clifftop that in the 13th century overlooked tidal flats close enough to the coast that supply ships could reach the base of the rock and offload stone, timber, and provisions without a single ox cart being involved. These were not accidental choices, driven by some general's eye for dramatic terrain. They were economic decisions first, and military decisions second. The king's planners, led by his master mason James of St. George, knew that a castle they could not supply affordably was a castle they could not finish. And an unfinished castle was worse than no castle at all, because it broadcast weakness instead of strength. Even the ground beneath the castle mattered, in ways that went straight to the budget. Building on solid rock was ideal for structural stability. A foundation that would never shift, walls that would never crack from subsidence, a base that could support enormous weight without complaint. But it was miserable for the workers who had to cut into it, digging foundations through rock, carving out cellars and storage chambers, and above all, sinking a well deep enough to reach the water table. All of that was exponentially harder, slower, and more expensive in solid stone. The tools wore out faster. The labor took longer. The well alone could take months of chipping through unyielding rock before it produced a single cup of water. Building on clay or soft earth was the opposite problem entirely. Digging was fast and cheap. Foundations could be excavated in a fraction of the time, but the ground beneath you was an unreliable partner. Clay shifts. Water seeps through soft earth and pools where you do not want it. Foundations built on clay could slowly, quietly fail over decades, cracking walls and tilting towers in ways that were expensive to fix and impossible to ignore. Some castles built on soft ground required driven timber piles beneath the foundations, dozens of sharpened logs hammered deep into the earth to create an artificial platform of stability. An entire hidden construction project completed underground before a single visible wall went up. The money spent below the surface was money nobody would ever see or admire, which made it feel, to the Lord signing the bills, like money that simply vanished into the dirt. The modern equivalent is not hard to find. Anyone who has ever bought property knows that location drives cost more than almost any other factor. A house in the right spot is worth twice what the same house is worth in the wrong one. And anyone who has ever renovated knows the particular agony of spending thousands on work that disappears behind walls and under floors, money spent on plumbing and wiring and structural repairs that nobody will ever compliment you on. Medieval lords understood both of these principles instinctively, except their version of a bad location did not just cost them at resale. It could cost them a war. And their version of invisible structural spending was not a replumbed bathroom. It was a year of laborers hammering timber piles into clay, while the Lord watched his treasury drain, and his walls remained stubbornly unbuilt. So before a single dressed stone was cut, before a single laborer was formally hired, Before the first delivery of lime arrived on site, two enormous financial commitments were already locked in: the political cost of needing to build at all, and the logistical cost of where you chose to do it. You have committed your wealth, your reputation, and your family's future to a project that has not yet produced a single visible result, and you have not even met the most expensive person on your payroll yet. That person is the master mason, and he is about to become the most important, most indispensable, and most infuriatingly expensive individual you will ever employ. Forget the knights, forget the steward who manages your estates, forget the priest who tends to your soul. The master mason is the man who will determine whether your castle actually gets built, whether it stays standing, and whether the finished product looks like a fortress worthy of your name or an expensive pile of regrets. He is your architect, your structural engineer, your project manager, and your chief negotiator with the laws of physics, all wrapped into one person who knows exactly how much you need him and charges accordingly. The master mason was not some rough tradesman who worked his way up from carrying hods of mortar. He was a highly trained professional who had spent years, sometimes decades, learning his craft through a formal apprenticeship system that was as rigorous as anything the medieval world produced. A boy entered the trade at around 12 or 13, serving 7 years as an apprentice before becoming a journeyman, and then spent further years traveling between building sites across Europe, studying different construction traditions, different types of stone, different engineering solutions to the same fundamental problems. By the time a mason had the experience and reputation to be called a master, he understood geometry, load-bearing principles, the behavior of different types of stone under compression and tension, the chemistry of mortar and plaster, the engineering of arches and vaults and flying buttresses, and the practical management of hundreds of workers across multiple simultaneous operations. He could look at a hillside and see the finished castle inside it, the way a sculptor supposedly sees the statue inside the marble, except the mason also had to calculate what the statue would cost and whether the hillside would support its weight for the next 5 centuries. And he was paid like someone who knew all of those things. A common laborer on a castle building site in the late 13th century might earn 2 pence a day. A skilled stonecutter might earn 4 pence. The master mason earned 2 to 3 shillings a week, and a shilling was 12 pence. So the man running the project was earning roughly 3 to 4 times what a skilled craftsman earned, and 10 to 18 times what a common laborer took home. That gap alone tells you something about how the medieval world valued expertise when the expertise was rare enough. But the money was only part of it. A master mason's contract typically included a house on or near the site, a clothing allowance, food, fuel for heating, and in some cases, a fur-lined robe as a mark of his status. The robe was not a trivial detail. Fur-lined robes were markers of social rank, worn by officials and minor nobility. Giving one to a tradesman was a deliberate signal that this particular tradesman was to be treated as someone of consequence. He was not just paid well, he was housed, fed, dressed, and socially elevated by his employer, which meant his actual compensation was even higher than the already impressive wage suggests. James of St. George is the name that survives most prominently, and his story illustrates the point perfectly. Edward I brought him from Savoy, in what is now southeastern France and western Switzerland, to oversee the construction of the Welsh castles. James had already built castles for the Count of Savoy, and his reputation was exactly the kind of credential that justified crossing half of Europe to hire one man. James earned 3 shillings a day, not 3 shillings a week, 3 shillings a day. That is 36 pence per day, in an era when a skilled carpenter earned 5 or 6 pence and a laborer earned 2. James of St. George was being paid roughly 7 times the wage of a skilled tradesman and 18 times the wage of the men digging the foundations beneath him. Divide his annual earnings by a common laborer's daily wage, and you begin to see the scale of the investment in this single individual. In modern terms, imagine a construction project where the laborers earn $40,000 a year and the project director earns over $700,000, with a house, expenses, and direct personal access to the head of state thrown in. He was, by any measure, one of the best compensated professionals in 13th century England, and he was not even English. Here is the part that would have stung if you were the lord paying the bills. The master mason did not belong to you. He was not your retainer, not your vassal, not your man. He was a freelancer. Master masons moved between projects, between patrons, and between countries, following the money and the prestige the way a top consultant moves between corporations today. If a better offer arrived from a richer lord or a more ambitious king, your mason could leave, and the leverage was entirely on his side, because there were very few men in Europe with his combination of skills, and every lord with a half-built castle and a dwindling treasury knew it. You could not simply replace him with someone cheaper and expect the same result. A new master mason would need months to understand the existing design, assess the structural integrity of the work already completed, and develop his own plan going forward. He might disagree with his predecessor's choices. He might want to alter the design. He might discover problems that required expensive corrections. Changing masons mid-project was the medieval equivalent of switching architects halfway through building a skyscraper. Technically possible, financially catastrophic, emotionally devastating, and the social status of these men sat in a genuinely strange position. A master mason earned more than most minor knights. He had direct access to kings and princes. His decisions shaped buildings that would stand for centuries and define the skylines of entire regions. But he worked with his hands. He came from the trades. In the rigid social hierarchy of medieval England, that meant he occupied an awkward, unresolvable middle ground. Respected for his abilities, essential to the project, paid better than many members of the gentry, trusted with budgets that would make a baron nervous, and yet never fully admitted to the class of people whose castles he designed and built. He was the most powerful man on the building site, and one of the least powerful men at the dinner table inside the finished hall. It is one of those contradictions the medieval world was remarkably comfortable with and never bothered to resolve, because resolving it would have meant admitting that skill and knowledge were more valuable than bloodline, and that was a conversation nobody with a title was eager to have. But the master mason, for all his expense, was just one man. The real financial weight of a castle building project was not the salary at the top of the payroll. It was the sheer volume of human labor required to turn his plans into walls. And the scale of that labor force is something most people never think about when they look at a finished castle standing quiet and empty on a hilltop. A major royal castle at peak construction could employ thousands of workers simultaneously. Edward I's building campaigns in Wales regularly assembled workforces of 2,000 to 3,000 men, and at peak periods, the numbers climbed even higher. Some estimates for the busiest construction seasons at Beaumaris and Caernarfon suggest upward of 3,500 workers on site at once. To put that in perspective, many medieval towns in Wales and Western England had total populations smaller than that. The castle building site was, for the duration of the project, one of the largest concentrations of people in the region, a temporary city of labor that needed to be fed, housed, supplied, managed, disciplined, and paid, like any other settlement of that size. Except this settlement produced nothing that could be sold. It only consumed. The workforce was not a single uniform mass of interchangeable hands. It was a layered hierarchy, and each layer had its own recruitment pipeline, its own wage rate, and its own cost to the project. At the top, beneath the master mason, sat the skilled tradesmen, stone cutters who could shape a block to precise dimensions using nothing but a chisel, a mallet, and an eye trained over years of practice. Carpenters who built the scaffolding, the centering for arches, the roof structures, and the temporary buildings that housed the workforce itself. Smiths who made and endlessly repaired the iron tools that wore out with depressing regularity when struck against stone all day. Plumbers who worked with lead for roofing, gutters, and water pipes. Glaziers for the windows. Each of these specialists earned wages that reflected the years of training behind their skills, typically 4 to 6 pence a day, and they could not be easily replaced because their abilities took the better part of a decade to develop. Below the skilled trades sat the rough masons, men who could lay stone in courses and mix mortar to the correct consistency, but who lacked the precision cutting skills of a trained stone cutter. They earned less, perhaps 3 to 4 pence a day, but they were essential in large numbers because the sheer volume of stone that needed laying in a major castle was staggering. Miles of wall, dozens of towers, gatehouse complexes, internal partitions. Every one of those structures needed stone, laid course by course, day after day, for years. Below the rough masons sat the laborers. The carriers, the diggers, the haulers, the men who moved earth by the cartload, dragged rough stone from the supply dumps to the walls, mixed mortar by hand in wooden troughs until their arms burned, and did the brutal, grinding physical work that underpinned every other operation on the site. They earned the least, typically 2 pence a day, and they were needed in the greatest numbers. And then there were the conscripts. This is where the economics of castle building take a turn that most romantic accounts of medieval construction quietly leave out. The English crown had the legal authority to compel labor for royal building projects through a system of writs sent to county sheriffs. The writs were specific. They named the number of workers required, the skills needed, and the date by which they were to arrive at the building site. The sheriffs were responsible for recruiting and sending them, which in practice meant rounding up men from their farms, their workshops, and their families, and marching them across the country to wherever the king was building. These men were not volunteers. They were conscripted, and the distinction mattered. Some were paid, though often at rates below what a free laborer on the open market would accept for the same work. Some deserted en route, slipping away during the long march to Wales and disappearing back into the countryside. The records show that desertion was a persistent, systemic problem that the Crown never fully solved. Replacement writs were issued regularly throughout the construction campaigns, ordering fresh batches of workers to fill the gaps left by the ones who had already decided that building the king's castle was not worth the pay, the distance, or the danger. The logistics of keeping this enormous, shifting workforce functional were themselves a major line item on the project budget. 3,000 men needed food every single day, and the building site was often in a location too remote, too newly conquered, or too politically hostile to support local supply chains. Grain, salted meat, dried fish, cheese, ale, all of it had to be shipped in, sometimes by sea from English ports, sometimes overland, at the same punishing transport costs that applied to the stone. Temporary housing had to be constructed for workers who came from hundreds of miles away and had nowhere else to sleep. Tools had to be supplied in bulk and constantly replaced, because iron chisels and picks striking stone all day long wore down with a speed that turned the tool budget into a permanent, growing cost that never leveled off no matter how many replacements were ordered. And through all of these layers, the money flowed downward in a chain that grew thinner at every link. The king authorized the expenditure from the royal treasury. The funds passed to the officials overseeing the project, men like the constable or the clerk of works, who managed the accounts and took their administrative fees. The officials paid the master mason and the senior craftsman their contracted wages. The senior craftsmen managed the skilled workers beneath them. The sheriffs who recruited the conscripts took their own administrative cut for the trouble of finding, assembling, and transporting the men. The suppliers, who provided food, timber, iron, and lime, charged whatever the market and the urgency of the project would bear. And urgency, on a royal construction site, was always high. By the time the wages reached the laborer, At the very bottom of the pile, the man actually swinging the pick and hauling the stone up the scaffolding, the amount was the smallest fraction of the total expenditure that had been authorized in his name. The system that built the castle extracted value at every level, and the person doing the hardest physical work received the least reward for it. This was not a flaw in the system. This was the system, and nobody involved considered it unusual or unjust, because medieval economics did not operate on the assumption that hard work and fair compensation had any particular reason to be connected. The building site itself was loud, dangerous, and relentless. The sound of iron on stone carried for miles across the surrounding countryside, a constant percussive rhythm that started at dawn and did not stop until the light failed. The air was thick with chalk dust and the sharp, chemical bite of lime from the kilns that burned day and night, producing the mortar that held the walls together. Men worked in conditions that would shut down a modern construction site within minutes. No safety equipment, no hard hats, no fall protection. Scaffolding made of lashed timber poles that swayed and creaked in the wind, sometimes at heights of 60 or 70 feet above the ground. Injuries were common. Crushed fingers, broken bones from falling stone, burns from the lime kilns, falls from scaffolding that gave way without warning. Deaths were not rare. And the work continued regardless, through rain that turned the site to a churning mess of mud and stone dust, through cold that made iron tools painful to grip, through conditions that made the whole enterprise look less like a grand architectural project and more like a battlefield that happened to have walls growing slowly out of it. This was the reality behind the romance. Thousands of men, most of them far from home, many of them there against their will, doing back-breaking work for minimal pay to build a monument designed to glorify someone who would never lift a single stone. The castle that would eventually stand as a symbol of power and permanence and beauty was, during its construction, a monument to the economics of coerced labor, hierarchical extraction, and the cheerful willingness of the medieval ruling class to spend other people's bodies on their own ambitions. The pennants and the painted chambers came later. The mud and the exhaustion and the 2 pence a day came first. And all of that labor, all of those wages and provisions, and endlessly replaced tools still only account for part of the total cost. Because the materials themselves had their own prices, their own supply chains, and their own remarkable capacity to devour a building budget from the inside. Starting with the stone itself, let us follow a single block of stone from the moment it exists as part of a hillside to the moment it sits in your castle wall, because every hand it passes through and every mile it travels adds cost, and by the time it reaches its final position, you will understand why the materials budget on a castle project had a tendency to grow like something alive and hostile. It starts at the quarry, and the quarry is not the dramatic cliff face you might be imagining. Most medieval quarries were open pits, shallow excavations cut into a hillside or dug down into a seam of usable rock. The quarrymen worked with iron wedges, picks, and hammers, reading the grain of the stone the way a butcher reads the grain of meat, looking for natural fracture lines where the rock could be persuaded to split cleanly rather than shatter into useless rubble. This was skilled work, because a poorly placed wedge line could ruin an entire block, turning hours of labor into a pile of fragments fit for nothing but wall fill. The best quarrymen could feel the stone structure through their tools, sensing the point where the rock was ready to give before the crack became visible. It was a talent that took years to develop and could not be taught from a book, mostly because books were not widely available to the kind of men who spent their lives hitting rocks with iron. Once a block was freed from the face, it was rough-shaped at the quarry itself. This step mattered enormously for the budget, because rough shaping reduced the weight of the block before transport, and every pound you could remove at the quarry was a pound you did not have to pay to haul across the countryside. Quarry workers trimmed away the excess stone, knocking the block into an approximate rectangular shape that could be loaded onto a cart or sledge without wasting space. The trimmed waste stayed at the quarry, which is why medieval quarry sites are often surrounded by enormous mounds of stone chips and fragments, the visible evidence of centuries of cost optimization performed with hammers. The rough-shaped block then had to travel. If you were fortunate, your quarry sat within a mile or two of the building site, and the stone moved on wooden sledges dragged by oxen or on heavy carts with solid wooden wheels that groaned under the weight. If you were less fortunate, the stone traveled by road for 5, 10, or 20 miles, and every mile multiplied the cost. The carts broke, the wheels cracked, the axles snapped, the oxen needed rest and feed. The roads, such as they were, turned to swamps in rain and ruts in dry weather, and neither condition was kind to a vehicle carrying several hundred pounds of raw stone. If you were genuinely lucky, and if you had chosen your castle site with any financial sense at all, there was a river or a coastline between the quarry and the site, and the stone traveled by barge. Water transport was not just cheaper, it was transformatively cheaper. A single river barge could carry the equivalent of dozens of cartloads in a single trip, at a fraction of the cost per mile, with far less damage to the cargo and far less wear on the animals and equipment. The difference between a castle supplied by water and a castle supplied by road was not a minor budget adjustment. It was the difference between a project that might be completed and a project that would almost certainly stall when the money ran out. When the stone arrived at the building site, it entered the hands of the banker masons. These were the skilled stonecutters who worked at fixed benches, called bankers, shaping the rough quarry blocks into the precise dimensions required by the master mason's design. A banker mason used chisels, mallets, and measuring tools to transform a rough rectangle of stone into a finished ashlar, a block with smooth, flat faces and sharp, true edges that would fit tightly against its neighbors in the wall, with only a thin layer of mortar between them. The skill required was considerable. A block cut even slightly out of square would not sit properly, which meant the courses above it would be thrown off, which meant the wall would lean, which meant years of work and thousands of pounds could be compromised by a single, poorly dressed stone. Banker masons left their marks on their work. Small symbols, a cross, a crescent, an arrow, a letter, carved into the face of each finished block before it was set into the wall. These were not decorative, they were accounting tools. Many banker masons were paid by the piece rather than by the day, and the mark identified which mason had cut which block, allowing the clerk of works to calculate wages accurately. If you visit a castle ruin today and look closely at the stones, you can sometimes still see these marks, each one a tiny signature, left by a man whose name has been lost, but whose work has survived 700 years. It is a strange kind of immortality. Anonymous, functional, and carved into the surface of something that was never meant to be noticed. The finished block then went to the setters, the masons who actually built the wall. They laid each stone into a bed of wet mortar, checked the level and alignment, adjusted the position, and moved on to the next. The mortar had to be mixed correctly, wet enough to bond, but not so wet that it would ooze out under the weight of the stone above. The proportions of lime, sand, and water mattered enormously, because bad mortar meant weak walls, and weak walls meant a castle that might not survive its first serious storm, let alone its first siege. Setting stone was slower work than cutting it, because each block had to be precisely positioned and then left to cure before the next course could be safely added on top. You could not simply stack stones quickly and hope for the best. The mortar needed time to set, and the wall needed time to settle under its own growing weight. Rushing the process was a guaranteed way to end up with cracks, bulges, and eventual collapse, and every single step in that chain, from quarry face to finished wall, cost money. The quarryman's wages, the rough shaper's wages, the cost of the oxen and the carts and the barges, the banker mason's piece rate, the setter's daily wage, the mortar mixer's daily wage, the cost of the tools that wore out and had to be replaced at every stage. By the time a single dressed stone sat in its final position in the wall, it had passed through at least 5 or 6 pairs of hands, traveled anywhere from 1 to 50 miles, and accumulated a cost that would astonish you if you stopped to add it all up. Multiply that by the tens of thousands of stones required for even a modest castle, and you begin to understand why the materials budget was not a line item. It was the line item, the one that kept the lord awake at night and the clerk of works reaching for stronger ale. But stone, for all its expense, was only one of the 3 major materials that a castle demanded, and the other 2 had their own gift for consuming money in quantities that seemed almost personal. Lime was the invisible essential. Without lime, there was no mortar. Without mortar, there were no walls. Just dry stacked stone that would shift and settle and eventually tumble. Lime mortar was what held the entire structure together, and producing it was an industrial operation that most accounts of castle building barely mention, which is remarkable given how much it cost. Making lime mortar required limestone, which had to be quarried separately from the building stone. The limestone was then burned in kilns at extremely high temperatures for extended periods, sometimes days, until it calcified into quickwhite. Quickwhite was caustic, dangerous to handle, and reactive with water. It was mixed with water in a controlled process called slaking to produce lime putty, which was then combined with sand to create the mortar used between the stones. Every stage of that process required fuel, enormous quantities of fuel. The kilns burned constantly, and they burned timber or charcoal, both of which had to be sourced, transported, and paid for. In heavily wooded areas, the fuel might be relatively affordable. In areas where the timber had already been depleted by previous building projects or by agricultural clearance, the fuel cost alone could rival the cost of the stone it was being used to bind together. Timber was the second hidden expense, and its role in castle building extended far beyond the finished wooden elements like roof beams, floor joists, and door frames. Timber was the infrastructure of construction itself. Scaffolding was built from timber, the centering that supported arches and vaults during construction, the curved, temporary frameworks that held the stones in position until the mortar set and the arch could support itself, was built from timber and had to be precisely shaped by skilled carpenters. Temporary buildings on the construction site, workshops, storage sheds, housing for workers, offices for the clerk of works, all timber. Hoisting machines, cranes, treadwheel cranes operated by men walking inside a giant wooden wheel, like medieval hamsters, all timber. And all of it wore out, broke down, or was dismantled and rebuilt as the construction progressed upward and the scaffolding had to follow. The demand for timber on a major castle project was so constant and so large that it could strip the surrounding landscape. Forests that had stood for generations were felled to feed the building site, and the environmental impact was visible for decades afterward. The cost of timber rose as the nearest sources were exhausted and the supply had to come from further away, which meant, once again, transport costs eating into the budget with the same relentless appetite they showed for every other material. And then there was lead. Lead roofing was the prestige choice, the material that said your castle was not just functional, but important. A lead roof was waterproof, durable, fire-resistant, and spectacularly expensive. Lead had to be mined, smelted, cast into sheets, and transported to the site, and every one of those steps carried its own cost. A castle roofed in lead made a statement. A castle roofed in timber shingles or thatch made a different, considerably less impressive statement. The cost difference between lead and thatch for a single roof could represent years of a laborer's wages, which meant the choice of roofing material was as much a financial and political decision as a practical one. You did not roof your castle in lead because lead was the best material for keeping rain out. You roofed it in lead because lead told everyone who looked at your castle that you could afford to roof it in lead. Vanity, it turns out, works just as well when it is nailed to the rafters. Between the stone, the lime, the timber, and the lead, The materials for a major castle represented a staggering investment before a single design decision had been made about what the finished building would actually look like. And it is those design decisions, the choices about walls and towers and windows and stairs, where the real secrets of medieval castle building start to reveal themselves. Because every single architectural feature you associate with a castle was, underneath the romance, a line item on a budget that somebody was desperately trying to control. The numbers become vivid when you attach them to a specific project. Consider a castle of moderate ambition, not one of Edward's Welsh fortresses, but something a prosperous baron might attempt on his own estates in the late 13th century. The stonework alone, quarrying, shaping, transporting, and setting, might consume 40 to 50% of the total budget. The lime and mortar production, including the fuel to keep the kilns burning for months or years on end, could account for another 10 to 15%. Timber, including scaffolding, centering, temporary structures, hoisting equipment, and the finished wooden elements inside the castle, added another 15 to 20%. And lead, if the Lord chose it for the roof, could add a further 5 to 10% on top of everything else. Add those figures together, and you realize that the raw materials, before counting a single day of labor, before feeding a single worker, before replacing a single broken chisel, could account for 2/3 or more of the entire project cost. The labor was enormous. The materials were worse. And the timing of material delivery created its own financial pressure. Construction was seasonal. The building season ran roughly from April to October because mortar does not set properly. In freezing temperatures and wet winter conditions made construction dangerous and inefficient. That meant the Lord had roughly 7 months each year to make progress, and every week of that season needed to be productive, because an idle workforce was a workforce you were paying to do nothing. Materials had to arrive on time and in sufficient quantity to keep thousands of workers occupied. A delayed shipment of stone from the quarry could halt an entire section of the wall. A shortage of lime could stop mortar production and leave setters standing at empty walls with nothing to bind. A timber delivery that arrived late meant scaffolding could not be erected for the next level of construction, which meant the masons could not work, which meant the whole schedule slipped. The clerk of works, the man who managed the day-to-day finances and logistics of the building site, had one of the most thankless jobs in medieval England. He was responsible for ordering materials, coordinating deliveries, paying wages, keeping accounts, managing disputes between craftsmen, reporting to the Lord or the Crown on progress and expenditure, and somehow keeping the entire operation moving forward on a budget that was almost certainly insufficient for what was being asked of it. The surviving accounts from major castle projects read like the diary of someone slowly losing a fight with arithmetic. Costs that were estimated at one figure in the planning stage arrived at the site as a considerably larger figure once transport, wastage, breakage, and the general tendency of medieval suppliers to charge what they thought they could get away with had been factored in. Wastage was its own quiet disaster. Stone cracked during transport. Blocks split during cutting when a hidden fault line revealed itself at the worst possible moment. Mortar, mixed in the wrong proportions, had to be discarded. Timber warped or rotted if it was stored improperly between seasons. Lead sheets could be damaged in transit. Every material had a wastage rate, and that rate was built into the cost whether anyone acknowledged it in the budget or not. A prudent clerk of works ordered more than he thought he needed, and hoped the surplus would cover the inevitable losses. An optimistic clerk of works ordered exactly what the plans required, and then spent the rest of the season writing increasingly desperate letters requesting additional supply. The suppliers themselves occupied a powerful position in this ecosystem. A quarry owner with the right type of stone and a location convenient to a major building project could name his price, because the Lord could not simply switch to a different quarry without adding transport costs that would dwarf any savings on the stone itself. timber merchants near castle sites found their product suddenly in enormous demand, and they adjusted their prices accordingly. Lime burners, charcoal makers, iron suppliers, all of them understood that a castle under construction was a customer that could not walk away, and they priced their goods with that knowledge sitting comfortably in the front of their minds. The economics of supply and demand worked exactly the same way in the 13th century as they do today, with exactly the same tendency to favor the seller when the buyer has no realistic alternative. Now we get to the part where the money becomes visible. The walls, the towers, the windows, the stairs, every feature that makes a castle look like a castle was a decision, and every decision was a negotiation between what the Lord wanted, what the master mason recommended, and what the budget could survive. The secret design of a medieval castle is not some hidden blueprint locked in a vault. It is the accumulated result of hundreds of financial compromises made over years of construction, each one leaving its mark on the finished building in ways that are still legible today if you know where to look. Start with the walls themselves. The thickness of a castle wall was not simply a military calculation about how much force it needed to withstand. It was an exponential cost calculation that the Lord felt in his treasury with every additional foot. A wall 6 feet thick does not cost twice as much as a wall 3 feet thick. It costs considerably more than twice as much because the volume of stone increases dramatically with thickness, and the volume is what drives the material cost, the transport cost, the labor cost, and the time. Thicker walls also required deeper foundations, which meant more digging, more below-ground work that nobody would ever see, and more of that particular agony of spending money on invisible structural necessity. A lord who wanted walls 10 feet thick at the base was not making a decision about defense. He was making a decision about how many years of his estate's income he was willing to bury underground and pack into stone that would never be admired by anyone except the enemy trying to get through it. The shape of the towers tells an even more interesting financial story. Early castle towers were square. Square towers are relatively simple to build because the stonework involves straight lines, right angles, and flat faces that any competent mason can produce. They are structurally adequate, they are functional, and by the mid-13th century, they were increasingly considered old-fashioned. Round towers were the upgrade. A round tower is structurally superior to a square one because it has no corners. Corners are weak points. An attacker can undermine the corner of a square tower by digging beneath it, and once the corner collapses, the two adjoining walls often follow. A round tower distributes force evenly around its circumference, making it far more resistant to undermining and battering. It also eliminates blind spots, because defenders on a round tower can see and shoot in every direction without the dead angles that corners create. But round towers cost significantly more to build. Every stone in a round tower must be cut with a curved face, and curved stonework requires more skilled labor, more precise cutting, and more material waste than straight work. The banker masons, shaping stones for a round tower, spent more time per block, produced more unusable offcuts, and needed a higher level of geometric understanding than their counterparts working on a straight wall. The scaffolding for a round tower was more complex to construct. The centering for round arched openings within the curved wall added further expense. A lord who chose round towers over square ones was paying a meaningful premium for the upgrade, and while the military justification was real, the social pressure was equally powerful. By the late 13th century, building square towers when you could afford round ones was like showing up to a formal event in last decade's fashion. Technically acceptable, socially noted. Then there were the windows. A narrow arrow loop, a thin vertical slit in the wall, designed to allow a defender to shoot outward while presenting the smallest possible target to attackers outside, was cheap. It required minimal stone cutting, minimal structural alteration to the wall, and no expensive materials like glass. A large window with a stone tracery frame, mullions dividing the opening into elegant sections, and glazed panels letting light pour into the interior was something else entirely. The stone tracery required the most skilled carvers on the site, men who could shape intricate decorative patterns from solid blocks without cracking the delicate connecting pieces. The glass had to be imported, because English glass production in the 13th century was limited in both quantity and quality. Each pane was small, held in place by lead strips called cames, and the whole assembly was fragile, expensive, and a nightmare to replace when it broke. A single large glazed window could cost more than an entire section of plain wall, and a castle with multiple glazed windows in its great hall and private chambers was advertising its wealth as loudly as any tower or gatehouse. The spiral staircase is one of the few design features that was genuinely, purely military and cost the lord almost nothing extra. Castle staircases spiraled clockwise as you ascended, which meant a right-handed defender fighting downward had room to swing his sword, while a right-handed attacker climbing upward had his sword arm pressed against the central pillar, restricting his movement. This was clever, effective, and required no additional expense beyond the normal cost of building a staircase, because the direction of the spiral was simply a design choice by the master mason, not a material upgrade. It is one of the rare cases where military ingenuity and financial prudence pointed in exactly the same direction, which probably explains why virtually every castle staircase in Europe follows the same pattern. The machicolations along the tops of the walls and towers, the projecting stone galleries with holes in the floor through which defenders could drop stones, boiling liquids, or other unpleasant surprises onto attackers below, were both functional and decorative. A simple parapet with gaps between the merlons was cheap. A projecting machicolation gallery, supported on stone corbels, was expensive because it required cantilevered stonework that projected outward from the wall face, supported by carefully designed and precisely cut brackets that had to bear significant weight without pulling away from the wall. The more elaborate the machicolations, the more expensive they were, and the more clearly they announced that the castle's owner had money to spend on features that were partly defensive and partly decorative. Like so many castle features, the machicolations sat at the intersection of function and vanity, and the budget felt every pound of both. Step through the gatehouse and past the walls, though, and the real surprise begins, because the inside of a medieval castle looked almost nothing like what you have been taught to imagine. If your mental image of a castle interior involves cold, bare stone walls, dark rooms lit by a few guttering torches, and a general atmosphere of grim austerity, you have been lied to by every film, television show, and history textbook that ever found it more dramatic to show castles as bleak than to show them as they actually were. The interior of a wealthy lord's castle was, by the standards of the age, warm, colorful, and deliberately designed for comfort. Not modern comfort. You would still find it cold, drafty, and inconvenient by the standards of a 21st century house. But compared to the damp timber halls of earlier centuries, a well-appointed 13th or 14th century castle interior was a significant step forward in domestic luxury, and the lord paid handsomely for every inch of that improvement. The walls inside were not bare stone. They were plastered and whitewashed, creating smooth, light surfaces that reflected whatever natural or artificial light was available. In wealthier castles, the plaster was painted with decorative patterns, geometric designs in red and blue and gold, or even figurative scenes depicting hunts, battles, or religious subjects. Some chambers were hung with tapestries, which served double duty as decoration and insulation, trapping a layer of still air between the fabric and the cold stone wall behind it. Tapestries were enormously expensive. A large tapestry of good quality could cost more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman, and a lord who filled his great hall with them was making a statement about his wealth that was as eloquent as any tower. The floors in the principal rooms were often tiled rather than bare stone or packed earth. Decorated floor tiles, with patterns pressed into the clay before firing and filled with contrasting colored slip, were produced by specialist craftsmen and laid in geometric arrangements that turned the floor into a visual display. The tiles were fragile, expensive to produce, and needed replacing when they cracked or wore down, which they did, with depressing regularity under the boots of everyone who walked across them. The alternative was rushes or straw scattered over the stone floor, which was cheaper, but needed regular changing and had a tendency to accumulate debris, spilled food, and the attentions of the castle's considerable population of dogs. The Great Hall was the center of castle life, the room where the lord ate, entertained guests, conducted business, dispensed justice, and displayed his status to everyone who entered. Its design was driven as much by social performance as by practical need. The hall needed to be large enough to impress, tall enough to feel grand, well lit enough to show off the decorations, and warm enough to be tolerable during the long winter months when the lord and his household were trapped indoors. The fireplace was the critical technology. Early halls used a central hearth with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke escape, which worked poorly, and filled the upper part of the hall with a permanent haze. The development of the wall fireplace with a proper chimney flue was one of the most significant domestic improvements of the medieval period, and it came with a price. Building a fireplace and chimney into a stone wall required careful engineering, specialized stonework, and a flue design that actually drew the smoke upward rather than pushing it back into the room. A poorly designed chimney was worse than no chimney at all, because it created a draft that pulled cold air into the room while failing to remove the smoke. Getting it right cost money. Getting it wrong cost money and comfort. The private chambers above or behind the Great Hall, known as sallers, were where the lord and his family retreated from the public life of the hall. These rooms were smaller, more intimate, and often more lavishly decorated than the hall itself, because they were the lord's personal space rather than his public stage. Glazed windows were more common in the solar than in any other room. Painted walls were more elaborate. The fireplace was often more carefully designed. The furniture, such as it was, concentrated here. A bed with a wooden frame, curtains for warmth and privacy, a chest for valuables, perhaps a chair rather than a bench. These were not rooms of luxury by any standard you would recognize, but they represented the upper limit of domestic comfort available in the 13th century, and every element of that comfort appeared on the building accounts as a cost that the Lord Steward recorded with the same resigned diligence he applied to every other expense that kept growing beyond the original estimate. And beneath the decorated surfaces and behind the plastered walls, hidden inside the structure of the castle itself, ran the engineering that made all of this habitable, the infrastructure that nobody saw, nobody admired, and nobody appreciated until it stopped working. The kitchen deserves its own mention because its design reveals a priority that most people would not guess. The kitchen in a major castle was not built inside the main structure. It was a separate building connected to the Great Hall by a covered passage or a short walk across the courtyard. This was not an oversight or a matter of convenience. It was a fire precaution. A medieval kitchen ran on open flame. Roasting spits turned over blazing hearths. Ovens burned continuously. Fat dripped into fire and flared. In a timber-roofed building, a kitchen fire could spread to the hall, the chambers, and the entire interior within minutes, destroying years of construction and a fortune in furnishings. Separating the kitchen from the main building was an insurance policy built in stone, and it added the cost of an entirely separate structure to the project, complete with its own foundations, its own walls, its own roof, and its own chimney system designed to handle the volume of smoke and heat that a working kitchen produced daily. The cost of outfitting the interior went beyond walls and floors and fireplaces. Every functional element of castle life required its own investment. The buttery and the pantry, the rooms where drink and bread were stored and distributed, needed secure doors and proper ventilation to prevent spoilage. The cellar needed to be cool, dry, and accessible. which often meant excavating beneath the main building and lining the space with stone to prevent damp from ruining the stores. Storage chambers for grain, salted meat, and other provisions needed to be designed with airflow in mind, because poorly stored food rotted and poorly ventilated spaces bred the kind of damp that crept into everything and ruined supplies that had cost real money to acquire and transport. Even the doors and their hardware were a significant expense. A heavy oak door for the Great Hall, or the gatehouse, required seasoned timber, skilled carpentry, and ironwork that included hinges, bolts, locks, and reinforcing bands. The ironwork alone was costly, because iron was not cheap, and a castle smith's time was already stretched thin, keeping the construction tools in working order. A lock for a treasury door or a private chamber was a specialist item, made by a locksmith whose skills were rare and whose prices reflected it. The keys themselves were status objects, large and ornate, carried visibly by the lord or his steward as a symbol of authority over the household. A good lock and key set for a single important door could cost more than a laborer earned in a month, which seems excessive until you consider what was behind the door. And then there was the question of furnishing the chapel, which occupied a unique position in the castle's interior economy. The chapel was not optional. A lord was expected to maintain a place of worship within his castle, and the quality of that chapel reflected directly on his piety and his standing. This meant the chapel received some of the finest craftsmanship in the entire building. Carved stone altarpieces, stained glass windows that cost more per square foot than any other glazing in the castle, painted walls with religious scenes executed by specialist painters who were brought in specifically for this work and paid accordingly, silver or gilt vessels for the sacraments, embroidered altar cloths. The chapel might be one of the smallest rooms in the castle, but its cost per square foot was often the highest, because the expectations for quality and craftsmanship in a sacred space exceeded those applied to any secular room, no matter how grand. A lord who skimped on his chapel risked his reputation in a way that skimping on a tower or a window never would. Military weakness could be explained away by strategic choice or temporary budget constraints. Spiritual neglect could not. The chapel was the one room in the castle where spending less than your neighbors was not just a social embarrassment, but a moral failing. And the medieval aristocracy took moral failings, or at least the appearance of them, very seriously when other people were watching, which, in a castle designed to impress visitors, they always were. Competitive piety was expensive, but competitive piety in a building already designed for competitive display was a combination that could strip a budget to the bone and leave the lord wondering how a room that seats 20 people managed to cost more than the wall that protects 200. Water is the thing that will kill your castle before any army gets the chance. Not water as a weapon, though that was a concern too, but water as an absence. A castle without a reliable water supply is not a fortress. It is a stone box that becomes uninhabitable the moment someone decides to wait outside until everyone inside gets thirsty enough to surrender. And securing that water supply was one of the most expensive, most labor-intensive, and most completely invisible engineering projects in the entire construction. The well was the heart of the system, and digging it was an act of optimistic brutality directed at the earth beneath your foundations. The depth required depended entirely on the geology of the site, which brings us back to the cruel irony of site selection. Remember that hilltop you chose for its commanding views and defensive advantage? The water table sits far below it. A castle built on a river plain might need a well of 20 or 30 feet. A castle on a hilltop could need a well of 100 feet or more, punched straight down through solid rock by men working in a narrow shaft with hand tools, hauling the broken stone up in buckets, one painful load at a time. The well at Beeston Castle in Cheshire was cut over 360 feet deep through sandstone to reach the water table. 360 feet. That is deeper than a 30-story building is tall, carved downward into rock, by men who had no power tools, no mechanized drilling, no ventilation systems, and no guarantee that they would find water at the bottom. The labor required for a well of that depth was measured in months, sometimes years, of continuous work, and the cost was staggering when translated into wages, tool replacement, and the simple logistical problem of keeping men working at the bottom of a deep, dark, narrow hole in the ground, with nothing but candlelight, and the distant hope that the rock would eventually produce something to drink. Divide the depth of the Beeston well by the number of inches a man with a pick could reasonably cut through sandstone in a day, and you begin to understand why some lords chose to abandon hilltop sites entirely rather than face the cost of reaching the water table. A carpenter, earning 5 pence a day, would have needed to work for decades to earn the equivalent of what the Beeston well cost to dig, and the well produced no visible result. No visitor to the castle would admire it. No rival lord would feel intimidated by it. It was a hole in the ground that cost a fortune and existed solely so that the people inside the castle could continue to exist inside the castle. The most essential piece of engineering in the entire building was also the least impressive to look at. For castles where the water table was too deep or the rock too stubborn, cisterns provided an alternative. A cistern was a large underground tank lined with waterproof mortar, designed to collect and store rainwater channeled from the roofs and courtyards through a system of gutters and downpipes. The engineering was straightforward in principle, but demanding in execution. The tank had to be completely watertight, because a leaking cistern was worse than useless. It wasted the water it was meant to save, and it introduced damp into the foundations, which could undermine the structural integrity of the walls above. The guttering and channeling system had to be designed to capture as much rainfall as possible without allowing debris, bird droppings, or other contaminants to enter the stored supply. And the cistern had to be large enough to hold sufficient water to sustain the castle's population through a dry summer or, worse, a siege of uncertain duration. Some castles used both systems, a well for primary supply and a cistern for backup, which meant paying for 2 separate water engineering projects and maintaining both indefinitely. The belt and suspenders approach to medieval water security was not paranoia, it was experience. A well could run dry in drought. A cistern could crack and leak. A single source of water was a single point of failure, and a single point of failure in a castle was an invitation to anyone who wanted to take it from you. Once you had water, you needed to move it. In a simple castle, that meant carrying it by hand from the well to wherever it was needed, which was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and exactly the kind of repetitive daily task that made castle life considerably less romantic than it looks in the paintings. In a more sophisticated castle, lead pipes carried water from a cistern or a wellhead to different parts of the building, providing something approaching a water distribution system. Lead was expensive, as we have already established, and lead piping required skilled plumbers to install and maintain. The pipes corroded, they cracked in freezing weather, they developed leaks at joints, and repairing them often meant tearing into finished walls to reach the damaged section. The cost of installing a piped water system was significant. The cost of maintaining it was eternal. And then there was the other end of the water problem. What goes in must come out. And managing waste in a stone building, occupied by dozens or hundreds of people, was an engineering challenge that the medieval world addressed with more ingenuity and more expense than most people give it credit for. The garderobe was the medieval toilet, and its design was a small masterpiece of practical engineering disguised as an afterthought. A garderobe was a small chamber built into the thickness of the castle wall, with a stone seat over a shaft that dropped vertically to the base of the wall or into a cesspit below. The shaft was angled outward so that the waste fell away from the wall face, and in some castles the shaft opened over the moat or a river, providing a crude but effective form of disposal. In others, the shaft emptied into a cesspit that had to be periodically cleaned out by men whose job title has mercifully been lost to history, but whose working conditions can be imagined with uncomfortable clarity. The engineering required to integrate a garderobe into a castle wall was not trivial. The shaft had to be built into the wall during construction, not added afterward, which meant the master mason had to plan the location and route of every garderobe shaft as part of the original design. The shaft could not weaken the structural integrity of the wall it passed through. The chamber needed ventilation to prevent the smell from permeating the adjacent rooms, which meant small windows or air holes that had to be positioned carefully to create a draft without creating a defensive vulnerability. Some garderobes had wooden doors for privacy, some had curtains, some had nothing at all, because medieval attitudes toward privacy in bodily functions were considerably more relaxed than modern sensibilities would find comfortable. A well-designed garderobe was a genuine luxury. It meant you did not have to use a chamber pot, which had to be emptied by a servant, or trek to an outdoor latrine in the middle of a winter night. A castle with multiple garderobes at different levels and in different wings was a castle that had invested in the daily comfort of its residents, even if that investment took the form of carefully engineered holes through which human waste fell several stories into a pit. The drainage system extended beyond the garderobes. Rainwater needed to be channeled away from the walls and foundations to prevent the kind of chronic damp that could slowly destroy a building from the inside. Drainage channels were cut into floors and built into wall bases, directing water toward outlets that carried it away from the structure. Kitchen waste, wash water, and the general runoff from a building housing a small community all needed somewhere to go, and that somewhere needed to be engineered in advance, because retrofitting drainage into a finished stone building was expensive, disruptive, and rarely entirely successful. Ventilation was the third invisible system, and its evolution tracks one of the most important domestic improvements of the medieval period. The earliest castle halls used central hearths, open fires burning on a stone platform in the middle of the room, with smoke rising to the ceiling and escaping, in theory, through a louvre, an opening in the roof covered by a small raised structure, designed to let smoke out while keeping rain from coming in. In practice, the louvre system worked imperfectly at best. Smoke filled the upper reaches of the hall, blackening the roof timbers and creating a permanent haze that stung the eyes and settled into fabric, food, and lungs. The wall fireplace changed everything. By building the fire against one wall and channeling the smoke upward through a stone flue and chimney, the smoke was removed from the room entirely, or nearly so. The hall stayed warm without filling with haze. The ceiling could be higher and cleaner. The decorative possibilities expanded dramatically because there was no longer a column of smoke rising through the center of the room, obscuring everything above head height. But the wall fireplace required careful design. The flue had to be the right dimensions to create an effective draft. Too narrow, and it blocked. Too wide, and it drew heat out of the room, along with the smoke. The chimney had to be tall enough to create sufficient updraft, and it had to be built into the wall from the foundation up, which meant another structural element that the master mason had to plan from the very beginning of the project. A castle with multiple fireplaces and chimneys, one in the great hall, one in the solar, one in the kitchen, perhaps others in guest chambers and service rooms, was a castle with a complex network of flues running through its walls like a stone cardiovascular system. Each flue had to avoid intersecting with other structural elements, with garderobe shafts, with window openings, with stairways. The walls of a major castle were not solid blocks of stone. They were honeycombed with shafts, channels, passages, and voids that served the invisible infrastructure of daily life. And designing all of those systems to coexist within the same walls without compromising each other or the structural integrity of the building was one of the master mason's most demanding tasks. Nobody praised him for it. Nobody wrote poems about the elegant routing of chimney flues and garderobe shafts through a 12-foot thick curtain wall. But if he got it wrong, everyone who lived in the castle knew about it immediately, because the fire smoked, the toilet backed up, the walls ran with damp, and the Lord began asking pointed questions about where, exactly, all that money had gone. The invisible engineering was the foundation of habitability, and habitability was the difference between a castle that served as a functioning seat of power and a castle that was, in the end, just an extremely expensive and uncomfortable pile of rock. Speaking of spending that everyone noticed, the two most financially dramatic features of any castle sat at opposite ends of the spiritual and military spectrum, and both had a remarkable talent for consuming money far beyond their apparent size. The moat, since we are discussing water systems, deserves a correction that most people need to hear. The popular image of a moat is a deep channel of water surrounding the castle, filled with dark, still water, and possibly containing something unpleasant with teeth. The reality was considerably less cinematic. Most medieval moats were dry. A dry moat was simply a deep, wide ditch cut around the base of the castle walls, designed to make approaching the walls difficult and undermining them nearly impossible. Digging a dry moat was a major earthwork project that required removing thousands of tons of earth, but it did not require the engineering headache of filling the ditch with water and keeping it filled. A wet moat, one actually containing water, required a reliable water source, either a diverted stream, a natural spring, or a connection to a river. The engineering involved in channeling water into a moat, controlling its level, preventing it from draining away through porous ground, and managing the inevitable problem of stagnation, was substantial. A stagnant moat became a breeding ground for insects, a source of foul smells, and a health hazard that made the immediate surroundings of the castle unpleasant for the very people it was supposed to protect. Some wet moats were designed with inlet and outlet channels to keep the water flowing, which reduced stagnation but added complexity and cost to the system. Others simply accepted the stagnation as the price of having a water barrier and dealt with the consequences, which included, in some documented cases, outbreaks of illness among the castle's garrison and household traced to the fetid water sitting permanently at the base of their home. The wet moat had one additional function that most histories mention only in passing, and it connects back to the garderobe system. Remember those shafts dropping waste from the upper chambers down the exterior of the castle wall? In castles with wet moats, the garderobe shafts often emptied directly into the moat water. This was efficient in the sense that the waste was carried away from the wall face. It was considerably less efficient in the sense that it turned the moat into an open sewer, which rather undermined its defensive value by ensuring that any attacker who fell into it faced not just drowning, but drowning in something profoundly worse than water. The smell alone must have been remarkable on warm summer days, and the health implications for anyone living inside the castle, with this particular water feature lapping at the base of their walls, were not trivial. Medieval people were not ignorant of the connection between foul water and illness, even if they did not understand the microbiology behind it. They knew the moat smelled terrible. They knew it made people sick. They accepted it because the alternative was a dry ditch that was easier to cross. The cost of maintaining all of these water systems was ongoing and permanent. Wells silted up and needed cleaning, a process that involved sending a man down a shaft of terrifying depth to remove accumulated debris from the water source. Cisterns developed cracks that needed resealing with fresh waterproof mortar. Lead pipes corroded and leaked and had to be repaired or replaced. Garderobe shafts needed periodic clearing when the accumulated waste blocked the channel. Drainage systems clogged with debris and had to be flushed or excavated. The moat, if it was wet, needed its water level managed and its outlet channels kept clear of blockage. None of this work was glamorous. None of it was visible to visitors. None of it was the kind of expenditure that a lord could point to with pride when showing a guest around his fortress. But all of it was essential. All of it cost money, and all of it had to be done regularly, or the castle's habitability began to decay in ways that started small and grew steadily more serious. A blocked drain became a damp wall. A damp wall became crumbling mortar. Crumbling mortar became a structural weakness. A structural weakness became, eventually, a repair bill that dwarfed the original cost of building the drain properly in the first place. The castle punished neglect with compound interest, and the interest rate was brutal. It is one of the great ironies of castle construction that the features visitors admired, the towers, the battlements, the great hall, the painted chambers, were the features that needed the least maintenance, while the features nobody noticed, the well, the drains, the pipes, the garderobe shafts, were the features that demanded constant, expensive attention forever. The visible castle was a monument. The invisible castle was a machine, and machines need maintenance or they stop working. The gatehouse was the face of the castle, and like most faces, it cost far more to maintain than the body behind it. Every visitor, every merchant, every messenger, every rival lord, arriving to negotiate or to assess your strength, entered through the gatehouse, which meant the gatehouse had to accomplish two things simultaneously. It had to be the most heavily defended point in the entire fortress, because the entrance was the most obvious vulnerability in any walled enclosure, and it had to be the most visually impressive feature of the exterior, because first impressions in the medieval world carried the same weight they carry today. The gatehouse was where defense and vanity shook hands and agreed to split the bill, and the bill was enormous. Early castle gatehouses were simple openings in the wall, a gap with a wooden gate and perhaps a timber tower above it. By the late 13th century, the gatehouse had evolved into a complex killing machine wrapped in architectural grandeur. A mature Edwardian gatehouse, the kind James of St. George designed for the Welsh castles, was a self-contained fortification in its own right. Two massive flanking towers framing the entrance passage, with walls thick enough to withstand battering and tall enough to dominate the approach. The passage between the towers was the kill zone. Multiple portcullises, heavy iron grills that could be dropped from above to seal sections of the passage, divided the entrance into compartments. Murder holes in the ceiling of the passage allowed defenders above to pour boiling water, heated sand, or other deeply unwelcome materials onto anyone trapped between the portcullises. Arrow loops in the walls of the passage allowed crossbowmen to fire into the trapped attackers from both sides simultaneously. The entire system was designed to turn the act of entering the castle into a suicidal proposition for anyone who attempted it without invitation. The cost of building all of this was staggering on a per-square-foot basis. The portcullis mechanisms alone were major engineering installations. Each portcullis was a heavy grid of iron or iron-reinforced oak, sliding in vertical grooves cut into the stone walls of the passage, raised and lowered by a windlass mechanism housed in a chamber above. The ironwork for a single portcullis required a skilled smith working for weeks, and a gatehouse with 2 or 3 portcullises multiplied that cost accordingly. The grooves in the stonework had to be precisely cut, perfectly vertical, and smooth enough to allow the portcullis to drop freely under its own weight when released. A portcullis that stuck halfway down was not a defense, it was an embarrassment. The iron reinforcing bands, hinges, and locks for the main gates added further expense. A pair of heavy oak gates bound with iron and fitted with a drawbar mechanism could cost more than an entire section of curtain wall, because the combination of seasoned timber, skilled carpentry, and extensive ironwork concentrated a remarkable amount of material and labor cost into a relatively small area. The drawbridge, if the castle had one, added yet another layer of mechanical complexity and expense. A working drawbridge required chains, counterweights, a winch mechanism, and a pit in the entrance passage to receive the bridge when it was raised. All of it had to work reliably, because a drawbridge that jammed in the open position during an attack was not a charming mechanical quirk. It was a catastrophe, but the gatehouse was not just a machine for killing attackers. It was also the part of the castle that visitors saw first and remembered longest, and that dual purpose drove spending upward in ways that a purely military structure would not have demanded. The exterior facades of the gatehouse towers were often the most elaborately decorated surfaces in the entire castle. Carved stone details around the entrance arch, heraldic shields mounted above the gate, statuary in niches flanking the passage. At Caernarvon, the gatehouse and walls were decorated with bands of differently colored stone, creating a striped pattern deliberately modeled on the walls of Constantinople, because Edward I wanted his Welsh castles to evoke the grandeur of the ancient Roman and Byzantine empires. The message was not subtle. Neither was the cost. The decorative program on a major gatehouse required specialist carvers, imported stone in contrasting colors, and the kind of detailed design work that added weeks of skilled labor to sections of the building that could have been finished in plain dressed stone at a fraction of the expense. But plain dressed stone did not say what the Lord needed the gatehouse to say. The gatehouse needed to say that the person inside this castle was wealthy, powerful, cultured, and not to be approached lightly. And making stone say all of those things at once required the architectural equivalent of a very expensive speechwriter. Now, let us add it all up. The total cost of a medieval castle is one of those numbers that sounds abstract until you translate it into something a human being can feel. So let us do exactly that, starting with the biggest and best documented example available. Edward I's castle building program in North Wales consumed roughly 80,000 to 100,000 pounds over approximately 25 years, from the mid-1280s to the early 1300s. That is a single number covering multiple castles: Flint, Rhuddlan, Aberystwyth, Builth, Conwy, Caernarvon, Harlech, and Beaumaris, along with their associated town walls and supporting infrastructure. But even broken down by individual castle, the figures are staggering. Caernarvon, the most expensive single castle in the program, cost approximately £27,000. Conwy cost roughly £15,000. Harlech cost roughly £9,500. Beaumaris, the last and most ambitious, consumed approximately £15,000 and was never finished. Now translate those numbers. The annual revenue of the English crown in this period was roughly £30,000 to £40,000. Caernarvon alone consumed nearly an entire year's royal income. The full Welsh castle program consumed the equivalent of roughly 2.5 to 3 years of total crown revenue, spread across 2.5 decades of construction, but concentrated most heavily in the first 10 years, when multiple castles were under construction simultaneously and the annual expenditure routinely exceeded the crown's ability to pay for it from current income. Translate further. A common laborer earned roughly 2 pence per day. There are 240 pence in a pound. Caernarvon's £27,000, therefore, represented approximately 6,480,000 laborer days. Divide that by a working year of roughly 250 days, accounting for Sundays and holy days when work stopped, and you get roughly 25,900 laborer years, one castle. 25,000 years of one man's working life. The number is almost meaningless in its scale, which is precisely why the Carpenter Day translation exists, to make you feel the weight of a sum that would otherwise slide past as just another large number in a history book. For a lesser lord, the numbers were smaller but no less painful relative to income. A modest baronial castle, not a royal fortress, but a respectable stone enclosure with a hall, a tower, a gatehouse, and a curtain wall, might cost between £1,000 and £2,000. A prosperous barony might generate an annual income of £200 to £400, which meant the castle represented somewhere between 3 and 10 years of the lord's entire revenue, every penny, before he spent a single coin on food, clothing, wages for his household, taxes to the crown, or any other expense. The castle was not an investment that fit comfortably within a budget. It was a financial commitment that consumed the budget entirely and left the lord borrowing against future income to cover the gap. And borrowing was exactly what many lords did. Italian banking houses, the Ricciardi, and later the Frescobaldi, lent money to the English crown and to individual lords to finance construction projects that could not be funded from current revenue. The interest was significant, the terms were not generous, and the consequences of default were severe, because a banker who was not repaid stopped lending, and a lord who could not borrow could not build, and a lord who could not build could not hold, and a lord who could not hold was, eventually, a lord who was not a lord anymore. The financial chain that connected a block of limestone in a Welsh quarry to an Italian counting house in Lucca was long, fragile, and capable of snapping at any point, taking the lord's fortune and his family's future with it. The garrison and maintenance costs that began the moment the last stone was set were the final turn of the financial screw. A finished castle needed a permanent garrison, anywhere from 20 to over 100 men-at-arms, depending on the size and strategic importance of the fortress, and those men needed paying, feeding, housing, and equipping every single day, whether the castle was under attack or sitting peacefully in the countryside, doing nothing more aggressive than casting a shadow. Annual garrison wages alone could represent 5 to 10% of the castle's original construction cost, which meant the castle effectively rebuilt itself in expense every 10 to 20 years without a single new stone being laid. Add the cost of ongoing repairs, re-roofing, mortar repointing, timber replacement, well cleaning, drain clearing, and the steady procession of small maintenance tasks that a large stone building generates simply by existing, and the total lifetime cost of a castle over its first century of use could exceed its original construction cost by a factor of 2 or 3. The lord who built the castle was making a financial commitment not just for himself, but for his children, his grandchildren, and their children after them. Every generation inherited the walls and the debt that came with them. The numbers are clear. A medieval castle was not just the most expensive single object a lord could build. It was the most expensive ongoing financial obligation a family could take on. A commitment that began with the first shovel of earth and never, ever ended. The question was never whether you could afford to build a castle. The question was whether you could afford not to, and whether the political cost of not building outweighed the financial cost of building. For most lords, the answer was the same. You built, you borrowed, you hoped the walls would justify the sacrifice. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they did not. To make those figures tangible in a different way, consider what else that money could have bought. The £27,000 spent on Caernarvon Castle could have paid the annual wages of roughly 13,500 laborers for an entire year, which is to say, it could have employed a small army of workers doing literally anything else. It could have funded the construction of dozens of churches, hundreds of houses, or the establishment of multiple market towns with all their associated infrastructure. It could have endowed a monastery wealthy enough to last centuries. It could have equipped and maintained a military campaign for years. The decision to build a single castle was, in economic terms, the decision to forego every other possible use of that money, and the opportunity cost was as real and as large as the construction cost itself. The lord or the king who chose to build was not just spending money. He was choosing, deliberately, to not spend that money on anything else his realm might have needed. The crown understood this trade-off acutely. Edward I's castle-building program in Wales was funded partly from regular royal revenue, partly from special taxation, and partly from borrowing. The special taxes were not popular. The English Parliament, such as it existed in this period, was increasingly vocal about the cost of the king's building ambitions, and the tension between royal construction spending and the tax burden it imposed on the kingdom's subjects was a genuine political issue throughout the late 13th century. The castles were necessary for the conquest and control of Wales. Nobody disputed that. But the price of that necessity fell on the entire kingdom, not just on the king's personal purse. and the people who paid the taxes that funded the stonework in Caernarvon and Conwy had their own opinions about whether the expenditure was justified. The Italian bankers who financed a significant portion of the program operated on a scale that connected the medieval English construction industry to the international financial system. The Ricciardi of Lucca, who served as Edward's primary bankers for much of the Welsh campaign, advanced enormous sums against future tax revenues, effectively lending the king money today that would be repaid from taxes collected next year or the year after that. This was sovereign debt in all but name, and it carried all the risks that sovereign debt has always carried. When Edward's finances deteriorated during his later wars with France and Scotland, the Ricciardi found themselves overexposed and underrepaid. The banking house eventually collapsed, brought down in part by the sheer scale of the English crown's construction debts. The men who had financed the castles were ruined by the castles. The stones stood, the bankers did not. This pattern repeated at smaller scales across the English aristocracy. A baron who borrowed to build was making a bet that his future income would cover the repayments, and that bet assumed stable rents, good harvests, no unexpected military obligations, no royal demands for additional taxes, and no catastrophic events that might reduce the value of the estates whose income was supposed to service the debt. In a century that would eventually include the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 and the Black Death of 1348 to 1350, the assumption of stable future income was optimistic at best and delusional at worst. Lords who built in the late 13th century on the assumption that the good times would continue found themselves, within a generation or two, struggling to maintain castles they could barely afford to garrison, let alone repair. The maintenance burden deserves one more moment of attention, because it was the cost that never appeared in the original estimate and never stopped growing. A new castle, freshly built, with tight mortar joints and sound roof timbers and clean drainage channels, needed relatively little maintenance in its first decade. But stone buildings age, and they age in ways that demand attention and money in perpetuity. Mortar exposed to rain and frost slowly deteriorates, crumbling away from between the stones and allowing water to penetrate the wall core. Once water enters the core of a wall, it freezes in winter, expands, and forces the stones apart from the inside. A wall that looks solid from the outside can be slowly disintegrating internally, and by the time the damage becomes visible on the surface, the repair required is far more extensive and expensive than the preventive repointing that would have stopped the problem years earlier. Roof timbers rotted. Lead roofing sheets developed cracks at the joints where thermal expansion and contraction worked them back and forth with every change in temperature. Timber shingle roofs were vulnerable to fire, storm damage, and the simple decay that comes from years of exposure to rain and wind. Replacing a roof on a castle tower was not a job for a man with a ladder and a hammer. It required scaffolding, skilled plumbers, or carpenters, depending on the roofing material. New materials transported to the site at the same costs that applied during original construction, and weeks or months of work during which the rooms below were exposed to whatever the weather chose to deliver. The cumulative weight of these obligations meant that owning a castle was, in financial terms, less like owning a building and more like owning a living thing. It needed feeding. It needed care. It demanded constant attention and regular infusions of money. And it repaid neglect with decay that accelerated faster than the neglect that caused it. A lord who kept on top of his maintenance spent steadily and stayed solvent. A lord who deferred maintenance to save money in the short term spent more in the long term and risked losing the building entirely. And some lords did lose their buildings. Some never finished them. Some watched their fortunes crumble as steadily and as visibly as the mortar between their expensive stones. Beaumaris is the castle that tells you everything you need to know about what happens when ambition outpaces money. It was supposed to be the masterpiece. The final castle in Edward I's Welsh ring, designed by James of St. George at the peak of his experience. on a flat coastal site that eliminated the foundation problems of hilltop construction and allowed a perfectly symmetrical concentric design that military historians still describe as the most technically sophisticated castle plan ever drawn in medieval Britain. It was going to be the culmination of everything the Edwardian building program had learned over 2 decades of construction. It was going to be magnificent. It was never finished. Construction began in 1295 with an enormous initial workforce. The records for the first building season show over 2,500 workers on site, including 400 masons, 2,000 laborers, and assorted carpenters, smiths, and other specialists. The pace was furious. Walls rose quickly across the flat site, the inner and outer curtain walls taking shape simultaneously in a concentric layout that would have created 2 complete rings of defense, one inside the other, with the inner ring tall enough to allow defenders to fire over the heads of those manning the outer walls. The gatehouse complexes at the north and south were planned as massive, self-contained fortifications, each one larger and more elaborate than the gatehouse at Conchwy or Harlech. And then the money ran out. Not all at once, but in the slow, grinding way that financial exhaustion usually works. Edward's attention and his treasury were pulled toward his wars with Scotland, which demanded troops, supplies, and funds that competed directly with the Welsh building program. The workforce at Beaumaris shrank. The pace slowed. By 1300, the annual expenditure had dropped dramatically from the initial surge, and the construction was proceeding in fits and starts. A few months of work when funds were available, then months of inactivity when they were not. The outer walls were largely completed, though not to their full intended height. The inner walls rose higher, but remained unfinished at several points. The Great North Gatehouse, which was supposed to be the crowning architectural statement of the entire castle, was built to only a fraction of its planned height. The towers that were supposed to flank it and rise above the walls to provide commanding fields of fire were left as stumps, their upper stories existing only in James of St. George's drawings, never in stone. The South Gatehouse fared no better. The residential chambers that were supposed to occupy the upper floors of both gatehouses were never built. The chapel was never completed. The grand hall was never finished. What remains today is a ghost of a plan. You can walk through Beaumaris and see, in the height of the walls and the thickness of the foundations, what the castle was supposed to become. The scale of the ambition is written into every course of stone. But the upper third of the building, the part that would have turned it from impressive to extraordinary, simply is not there. It was never built. The money stopped, the masons left, and the most sophisticated castle design in medieval Britain became a monument to the gap between what a king could imagine and what a kingdom could afford. Beaumaris cost approximately £15,000 and consumed decades of intermittent work. £15,000 for a castle that was never finished. The full design, if completed, would have cost considerably more, perhaps £20,000 or beyond, pushing it close to Caernarvon in total expenditure. The money that was spent produced something functional but incomplete, a castle that could be garrisoned and defended, but that never achieved the architectural and military perfection its designer intended. It is the most expensive rough draft in English history. The records from Beaumaris include a letter written in 1296 by the project overseers to the Royal Exchequer, and its tone is the unmistakable sound of men who are watching a project die for lack of funds. The letter details the work that has been accomplished, describes the work that remains, and then states, with a directness that bureaucrats rarely achieve, that the project requires immediate additional funding or it will stall completely. The overseers make clear that workers are owed wages, that supplies are running short, and that the pace of construction cannot be maintained without a substantial infusion of cash. The cash did not come, not in the quantities needed. The letter survives as one of the most eloquent documents in medieval administrative history, a plea from men who understood exactly what they were building and exactly how far they were from being allowed to finish it. Beaumaris was a royal project, backed by the resources of the English crown, and even the crown could not finish it. For lesser lords, the risks were proportionally greater, and the consequences more personal. A baron who overextended himself on a castle-building project did not have a kingdom's tax base to fall back on. He had his estates, his rents, his harvests, and whatever credit his name still carried with the men willing to lend to him. When those resources proved insufficient, the consequences fell not on a distant treasury, but on a family. The records of medieval landholding are full of quiet disasters that trace back to construction debt. A lord borrows to build. The construction takes longer than planned. The costs exceed the estimates. The harvests in the intervening years are poor. The rents from tenants fall short because the tenants themselves are struggling. The interest on the loans accumulates. The lord sells a parcel of land to cover the immediate shortfall, which reduces his future income, which makes the next year's payments harder, which requires selling another parcel. The spiral is slow and relentless, and ends, in the worst cases, with the estate dismembered, the castle unfinished, or barely maintained, and the family name fading from the rolls of the landed gentry, with a quietness that belies the violence of the financial ruin behind it. You do not find these stories in the dramatic chronicles. They do not make for exciting reading. There is no siege, no battle, no betrayal by a trusted ally. There is only a ledger with numbers that stopped adding up, a property register with entries crossed out one by one, and eventually a name that simply ceases to appear in the records. The quiet ruin is the most common form of medieval aristocratic failure, and castle building was one of its most reliable causes. Some lords responded to financial pressure by cutting corners on the construction itself, which created its own category of problems. Walls built with cheap rubble cores instead of properly dressed stone, mortar mixed with too much sand and not enough lime, which saved money in the short term and produced joints that crumbled within decades. Foundations that were not dug deep enough because digging was expensive and the lord was in a hurry to see visible progress above ground. Timber used where stone was specified in the original design, because timber was cheaper and faster, even though it was less durable and more vulnerable to fire. Every one of these compromises saved money during construction and cost more money later when the consequences became apparent. A wall with a cheap rubble core could bulge outward under its own weight as the poorly bonded fill material shifted internally. A foundation that was too shallow could settle unevenly, cracking the walls above it. Cheap mortar crumbled and let water in, which froze and expanded and pushed stones apart, which required repairs that cost more than using good mortar would have cost in the first place. The castle, it turns out, was an unforgiving creditor. It remembered every shortcut and charged interest on every compromise, and the interest was always payable in stone, labor, and the kind of money that a lord who was already struggling to make ends meet did not have. Even for the lords who built well and finished their castles successfully, the financial story did not end with the last stone being set. The garrison was a permanent obligation that many lords underestimated because they focused on the construction cost and forgot about the operational cost that followed it. A small castle, a minor baronial fortification with a single tower, a hall, and a curtain wall, might need a garrison of 20 to 30 men. That sounds manageable until you calculate the annual cost. 20 men at arms, each earning somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 pence a day, represented a daily wage bill of roughly 100 pence, or nearly half a pound. Over a year of 365 days, that is approximately 180 pounds in wages alone, before food, equipment, clothing, and the other costs of maintaining armed men in readiness. For a barony generating 200 to 400 pounds a year in total revenue, the garrison alone could consume half or more of the annual income, leaving almost nothing for the lord's household expenses, his obligations to the crown, and the maintenance of the castle itself. A royal castle with a garrison of 100 men or more was correspondingly more expensive, but the crown had correspondingly more resources to draw on. Even so, the records show that royal garrisons were frequently underpaid, undermanned, or both. Constables wrote to the exchequer complaining that their men had not been paid for months and were threatening to leave. Garrison soldiers supplemented their irregular wages by hiring themselves out as laborers to local farmers during quiet periods, which kept them fed but reduced their readiness for the military duties they were supposedly being paid to perform. The gap between the theoretical garrison strength of a castle and the actual number of armed, equipped, and motivated men inside it at any given time was often significant, and that gap represented a vulnerability that any attacker with good intelligence could exploit. The constable who managed the castle on a daily basis was, in effect, running a small institution with all the administrative headaches that entails. He managed the garrison's wages, discipline, and equipment. He oversaw the household servants who maintained the domestic functions of the castle, the cooks, the brewers, the launderers, the stable hands, the porters, the chaplain. He managed the supplies, ordering and receiving the food, fuel, candles, and materials that the castle consumed continuously. He supervised the maintenance work, deciding which repairs were urgent, which could be deferred, and which would have to wait until the Lord sent more money, which might be soon or might be never. He kept the accounts, recording every expenditure, and reporting to the Lord, or the crown, on the financial state of the fortress. It was, by any modern standard, a management position of considerable complexity, and the men who held it were compensated accordingly. A constable of a royal castle could earn a substantial annual fee, plus accommodation and expenses, making it a desirable position for a man of the minor gentry. But the job came with the perpetual frustration of managing a building that always needed more money than it received, and a garrison that always needed paying sooner than the funds arrived. The constable was the man who stood between the castle's needs and the Lord's willingness to meet them, and the gap between those two things was the space in which his entire professional life was conducted. The castle as a functioning institution was, in the end, a small community with a large appetite and a permanent deficit. It consumed food, fuel, labor, materials, and money in quantities that never decreased and frequently increased, and it produced nothing in return except the intangible benefits of security, prestige, and territorial control. Those benefits were real. They were the reason the castle existed. But they could not be weighed on a scale or deposited in a strongbox. And when the Lord looked at his accounts and saw the castle's annual operating cost sitting alongside his annual income, the arithmetic was often deeply uncomfortable. The stones endured. The finances, more often than not, did not. And as the centuries turned and the military purpose of castles slowly faded, the buildings entered a new phase of their existence, one that nobody who laid the first stone could have predicted, and that would determine whether the castle survived to be seen by anyone living today. The thing about a castle is that it does not know when it has stopped being useful. The walls do not care whether the garrison behind them numbers 100 men or none. The towers do not notice when the last soldier leaves and the first sheep wanders in through the open gate. Stone is patient. Stone endures. And in that endurance lies the strange, slow, centuries-long afterlife that turned medieval military installations into the ruins, the tourist attractions, the wedding venues, and the romantic symbols that they are today. The military purpose of castles faded gradually, not in a single dramatic moment, but across generations of slow obsolescence. The development of gunpowder artillery in the 14th and 15th centuries did not immediately render castles useless, despite what simplified histories sometimes suggest. Early cannons were unreliable, inaccurate, and difficult to transport. A well-built stone castle could withstand early artillery bombardment without catastrophic failure, but the trajectory was clear. As cannons grew larger, more accurate, and more mobile, the high, thin walls of a medieval castle became increasingly vulnerable to a weapon they had never been designed to resist. A cannonball striking a curtain wall did not bounce off the way arrows, and even trebuchet stones often did. It punched through, shattering the stone and opening breaches that could not be quickly repaired. The response, eventually, was the development of entirely new fortification designs, low, thick earthwork bastions that could absorb artillery fire, which bore almost no resemblance to the towering stone castles of the 13th century. The age of the castle, as a cutting-edge military technology, was over, but the buildings remained, and what happened to them next depended entirely on who owned them, what they needed, and how much they were willing to spend on a structure that no longer served its original purpose. Some castles were converted. A lord who inherited a castle in the 15th or 16th century and found it militarily obsolete but structurally sound had a choice. He could abandon it and build a new manor house on a more comfortable site, or he could adapt the existing structure to serve as a residence. Many chose adaptation because the castle represented an enormous investment of ancestral wealth, and abandoning it felt like abandoning the family's history. Conversion typically involved adding larger windows to let in more light, building new domestic wings with higher ceilings and more comfortable proportions, filling in the moat or converting it to a garden feature, and generally softening the military character of the building into something that felt more like a home and less like a fortress. The results were often architecturally awkward. A medieval military shell stuffed with Tudor or Jacobean domestic additions that sat uneasily against the original stonework, like a comfortable armchair placed inside a bunker. But they were functional, and they allowed families to maintain their connection to buildings that had been in their possession for generations. Some castles were deliberately destroyed. During the English Civil War of the 1640s, Parliament ordered the slighting of royalist castles to prevent them from being used as strongholds again. Slighting meant deliberate partial demolition, enough to render the castle indefensible without going to the expense of leveling it entirely. Walls were breached, towers were undermined and collapsed, gatehouses were pulled apart. The work was done by soldiers and local laborers, often using gunpowder to bring down sections of wall that were too thick to demolish by hand in any reasonable time. The results are visible today in the dramatic collapses and breaches that give many English castle ruins their characteristic appearance. That crumbled tower, that gap in the curtain wall, that gatehouse standing with one side intact and the other reduced to rubble, these are not the results of centuries of gentle decay. They are the scars of a deliberate act of destruction carried out by men who understood that a castle's power lay in its completeness, and that breaking it was the surest way to end that power permanently. Some castles were simply abandoned and left to the slow work of weather, vegetation, and the quiet theft of their materials by local communities. This last process, known as stone robbing, was one of the most widespread and least dramatic forces in the destruction of medieval buildings. A castle that stood empty and unguarded on the edge of a village was an irresistible source of pre-cut, pre-shaped building stone, available for free to anyone willing to load it onto a cart and haul it home. Over decades and centuries, local farmers, builders, and householders helped themselves to the walls, carrying away dressed stone for houses, barns, walls, churches, and road surfaces. The robbing was rarely systematic. It happened piece by piece, cartload by cartload, one neighbor's new chimney built from another century's curtain wall. The castle shrank slowly, its outline growing less distinct with each generation, until what remained was a fragmentary ruin surrounded by a village whose buildings contained, embedded in their walls and foundations, the scattered remains of the fortress that had once dominated the landscape. The romance of ruins is a relatively modern invention. Medieval and early modern people did not look at a crumbling castle and see beauty. They saw a building that had failed, or a building that someone had broken, or a building that was full of useful stone waiting to be repurposed. The aesthetic appreciation of ruins as objects of beauty, melancholy, and historical contemplation began in earnest in the 18th century, when the Romantic movement discovered that a broken tower, silhouetted against a sunset, could provoke feelings of sublime emotion that a complete and functional building could not. Poets wrote about ruins. Painters painted them. Wealthy landowners who happened to have castle ruins on their estates discovered that the crumbling walls they had previously ignored or actively quarried for building materials were suddenly fashionable, and some went so far as to build artificial ruins on their grounds to achieve the same atmospheric effect without the inconvenience of actual historical decay. The Victorians took the romance a step further and began restoring castles, which sounds like a positive development until you examine what Victorian restoration actually involved. The Victorian approach to medieval buildings was guided less by historical accuracy than by an idealized vision of what the Middle Ages should have looked like. Architects added features that had never existed in the original design. They rebuilt towers taller than they had ever been. They inserted windows in styles that belonged to different centuries. They cleaned and repointed stonework with modern cement that looked nothing like the original lime mortar. They added battlements to buildings that had never been fortified, and turrets to buildings that had never had them. The result, in many cases, was a castle that looked more like a Victorian fantasy of the medieval period than anything a 13th century mason would have recognized. It was the architectural equivalent of a house flipper who guts a period property and replaces every original feature with what they think it should have looked like, based on a television show they half remember. Some Victorian restorations were carried out with genuine scholarship and careful attention to historical evidence. Others were creative exercises in historical fiction rendered in stone. The difficulty, for a modern visitor, is telling the two apart, because a well-executed Victorian addition can look convincingly medieval to an untrained eye, and a poorly executed one can look convincingly medieval to everyone except the specialists who know what to look for. The castles that tourists visit today are, in many cases, composite buildings, part medieval original, part Victorian invention, part modern conservation, layered together, like geological strata, in which each era left its own deposit of stone, interpretation, and financial investment. And that brings the castle's economic story to its final chapter, which is happening right now. The modern castle is, once again, a revenue-generating property, though the revenue comes from sources that would have baffled the lords who built them: tourism, weddings, film locations, corporate events, educational programs, gift shops selling pencils with tiny castles on the ends of them. The buildings that were designed to project military power and political authority now project heritage, atmosphere, and the particular brand of cultural prestige that only a genuine medieval ruin can provide. The economics of maintaining a castle ruin are, in their own way, as demanding as the economics of maintaining a functioning castle were 700 years ago. The walls still need stabilizing, the stonework still needs repointing, the drainage still needs managing, vegetation that grows in the mortar joints still needs removing before the roots pry the stones apart. Health and safety regulations require paths, railings, warning signs, and structural assessments that the medieval constable never had to worry about. The staff who manage, clean, guide, and protect the site need paying. The marketing that attracts visitors needs funding. The car park needs maintaining. The gift shop needs stocking. The castle, even in ruin, even stripped of its military purpose and its domestic function, continues to demand money from whoever claims responsibility for it. The obligation that began with the first shovel of earth in 1280-something has not ended. It has merely changed its terms. There is something quietly wonderful in that continuity. A building conceived as an instrument of conquest and control, financed by taxes and debt, built by conscripted laborers and freelance masons, designed to intimidate and impress, maintained through centuries of expense and neglect and partial destruction and romantic rediscovery and enthusiastic Victorian misinterpretation, still stands, still costs money, still demands attention, still draws people to it, not because they need its protection, but because they want to stand inside something old and feel the weight of the centuries in the stone around them. The castle has outlasted every purpose it was ever given, and found new ones that nobody planned. The walls do not care why you are here. They only care that you came, and with that thought, let the walls grow quiet. Tonight you have walked the length of a medieval building site, from the muddy hillside, where the first surveyor hammered the first stake, to the finished fortress, with its painted chambers, and its lead roof, and its chapel that cost more than the walls. You have met the master mason who designed it, the laborers who built it, the quarrymen who cut the stone, the clerk of works who lost sleep over the budget, and the lord who signed every bill and watched his fortune shrink with every course of stone that rose above the tree line. You have seen the numbers, the thousands of pounds, the millions of laborer days, the generations of income poured into limestone and mortar and lead. You have seen the failures, the unfinished gatehouses, the bankrupt families, the bankers who financed kingdoms and were ruined by them. You have seen the slow, strange afterlife of buildings that refused to disappear even when nobody wanted them anymore. But underneath all of those numbers and all of that stone, there were people, real people. The mason who carved his mark into a block of limestone in 1287 and never knew that someone would trace that mark with a fingertip 700 years later and wonder who he was. The laborer who walked 200 miles from his village to a building site in Wales because a sheriff told him he had no choice, and who spent a summer hauling stone up a scaffold in the rain for 2 pence a day, and who walked home again in the autumn and never spoke about it because nobody asked. The carpenter who built the centering for an arch and stood beneath it when the supports were removed, holding his breath until the stones held, and felt a pride he could not have put into words when they did. The Lord who stood on his unfinished wall at sunset and looked out over the land he was trying to hold and wondered, quietly, whether the money would last, whether the walls would be enough, whether any of it would matter in 100 years. It mattered. The walls are still there. The names, mostly, are not. But the work is. Every stone that sits in its course, every joint of mortar that has held for 7 centuries, every arch that still carries its own weight without complaint, is a testament to the skill, the labor, and the stubborn human determination of people who built something bigger than themselves and never expected to be thanked for it. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow and let the weight of the day leave your shoulders, spare a quiet thought for the builders, not the kings who ordered the castles, not the lords who paid for them, the builders. The men whose hands shaped the stones, and whose names were never carved into anything except the small, functional marks on blocks that were meant to be covered by plaster and forgotten. They built something that has outlasted every dynasty, every war, every empire that ever claimed ownership of it. They built something that is still standing while you are lying here, warm and comfortable, 700 years later, thinking about them. That is not a small thing. The stones remember, even when the histories forget. And tonight, if you listen very carefully as you drift off, you can almost hear them settling, the faintest creak of old mortar, the softest shift of weight against weight. The sound a castle makes when it is doing nothing at all except enduring, the way it always has, the way it always will, long after the last light goes out and the last voice fades, and there is nothing left but the stone and the silence and the slow, patient dark. Rest easy now. Let the old walls hold the night. You have earned your sleep, and the castle will still be there in the morning.